Ask an Aspiring Expert. Project by Bursek-Krekling. What do I think I do really well in the classroom? I make literature come alive for my students. I think I do a fairly good job of expressing my love of literature and getting my students to buy into it. The book to read is not the one that thinks for you, but the one which makes you think. This is a quote by Harper Lee, one of my favorite authors, and one I often share with my students. What was my motivation for sharing my love of literature with my students? Well, honestly, it was pretty much complete failure that I experienced in my first year of teaching high school, and the lack of interest I felt as a student when I was in high school. Back then, and even sadly today, the dynamic seems to be assign certain pages or chapters in a novel for students to read in an effort to discuss them the next day. What I found was happening was that there was very little discussion going on because my students weren't actually doing the reading. And it became more of a lecture and them sitting there and listening. And both of us were extremely bored. Dewey finds too many pupils with divided interests, and he believes their mental truancy is the result overemphasis on direct instruction and formal presentation. How would I qualify myself as an expert? I think from learning from years of hits and misses, taking what works and implementing it, and discarding what does not. Teaching many grade levels and abilities. I've taught anywhere from 7th grade to 12th grade. I've taught reading classes, language art classes. I taught a transitional education program. I taught blocks class, which was an intervention offered at my school for students who were in 10th grade who were below reading level in an attempt to get them up to reading level. I've also taught many inclusion English classes and honors classes. But what I think is my best qualification as an expert is a passion for the subject of reading and literature. How do I do this? Well, before reading, I front load and set a purpose for any kind of reading done in class. During the reading, we synthesize along the way and make sure we set our purpose. After reading, I make sure I have fully explained the material, and then I assess my students on it. Before reading, set the purpose and front load. I make sure that my students have enough background information for every single novel or any piece of material that we should read. For instance, if we're reading The Kite Runner, I make sure my students have background information on the Farsi culture and a good understanding of the history of Afghanistan. When we're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, we cover the Great Depression. We examine the Scottsboro trial and the injustice that took place, and we look at the Alabama state codes that were in place then during the setting of the novel, and we look at Harper Lee's biography, and of course we ask essential questions. Currently, we're reading The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, so I have my students complete this web quest in groups, using of course the internet. This asks questions about Shakespeare and the Globe Theater, gives them background information on ancient Rome, and gives them background information on the historical events that took place during the play. During reading, we synthesize along the way and set our purposes. I read almost every entire novel to all my students. We work together as a whole group to digest the text and answer higher level questions, not simply regurgitating the questions from a study guide. And we again address the essential questions. After reading, I make sure I have a full explanation of the text, and of course, I give an assessment to my students. I will not shy away from a traditional multiple choice test, but I prefer, and so do my students, a collaborative project. This is my attempt to deviate and to do a paradigm shift from a teacher-centered to a student-centered assessment. In this project, as you see here, which is the assignment I gave just today to my students, they may choose one of the different categories, whichever will scratch their creative itch the best, whichever if they want to work as individuals or if they want to work in groups. Not surprisingly, most students prefer to work in groups. Dewey's emphasis upon cooperative classrooms and projects draws first upon his belief that the will to cooperate, like our potential to think intelligently, is ingrained in human nature. Humans have, according to Dewey, an inborn need for companionship and mutual aid. Children especially have a natural impetus to contribute in their own unique way to conjoint projects. This is a student, one of my special ed students, who chose to work individually. She chose to memorize 10 lines from the tragedy of Julius Caesar. I chose this particular clip because the student was so much struggling to do this, but she did such a great job. I hope you can hear her. I hope you can hear that, but she really went from not being able to do anything to getting in front of the classroom and embracing and enjoying those. Now, this example are students I caught today practicing their lines that they chose to work in pairs. I believe they're playing Cassius and Brutus, and they're not typically engaged. I hope you can hear them. How do I know it works or it's successful? Well, test scores for one thing. I just gave my 2 regular English 10 classes, one of them is inclusion, a really challenging multiple choice 50 question test on Julius Caesar. I traditionally only give it to my honor students, but I was thrilled. Only 6 out of the 49 did not do too well on it. The rest did really well. I also have student participation, as you could see from the video clips, and student feedback. One of my crowning moments happened last year. A student from the beginning of the semester who flat out told me he couldn't read, did not enjoy reading. At the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, which by the way I read with a pretty butchered southern accent, at the end of it, his name was Big Mac, and at the end of it, he said in a really genuine and sincere way, "Aw, I didn't want that to end." That warmed the cockles of my literature-based heart.